All right, so looking at just bike handling, I think I'm going to do a two-part series. First part, I just want to cover some basics, some of the ground rules. The second thing, I want to look at some of the more advanced techniques like trail braking and the effect of braking and acceleration while turning. For now, let's just look at the basic geometry-based issues like wheelbase, the bike weight, the height of the center of gravity, whether the bike is got a steep rake or a long rake, uh, how quick it is to flick from left side to right side, that kind of thing. And all the, without really naming any names here or talking about any specific bikes, let's talk about this in general. So one of the things that people talk about in terms of handling is the wheelbase. And I put together a short, kind of quick, dirty slide to look at this issue. Now, there's an argument that the wheels define a chord on a circle, and then the circle of the turn has to go through that chord. And that's true, and certainly you can see here, what I did was I took the longer one here and I shortened it by 25%, or 50%, I forgot exactly what. But the point is that the wheelbase for the inside one to the right is much smaller than it is for the left-hand side. And you can see the corresponding turning circle for that chord is much smaller also. But the problem is that there are two reasons this doesn't quite hold true for motorcycles. The first one is that what defines your turning radius and your lateral acceleration are the turning speed and the lean angle. The wheelbase doesn't define that. Certainly at short, tight turns, really tight turns where the bike is vertical and you turn the steering wheel, that does determine the turning circle. There's no question about it. But in flowing turns where you're using counter steering, leaning the bike over, the lean angle is what determines the turning circle in combination with the bike's speed. Lateral acceleration is a simple function of lean angle. It's the tangent of the tangent of the lean angle. So if you're 45 degrees, you're going to be pulling 0.707 Gs. Doesn't matter what your wheelbase is, within reason, and certainly on roads. And it's a simple question of whether the tire adhesion is sufficient for that and whether you have enough ground clearance to make that kind of lean angle. Whether your wheelbase is 55 inches or 57 or 58 or 60 inches is not going to affect that to the degree that of any concern on the street, as long as you're making leaning turns. Now, the problem is that if you're not making a leaning turn, that's one thing, but that's an issue of riding technique. The other issue that happens is that it takes time for the bike to actually turn over from one lean angle to another. And this is where we run into a second problem, in that the bike might lean at the same angle, okay, regardless of wheelbase, but it takes time for the bike to flip into the turn, and until it flips to a steady state lean angle, that turn radius is larger than it should be at steady state. It will be at steady state. So one problem that you can really see coming up is that bikes that have lighter, less weight, and smaller thickness of tire, a higher profile actually is better in this regard because it allows the tire to fall over better. But bikes that have a high center of gravity, or that have very tall tires, like 21-inch tires, 18-inch tires versus 16 to 7-inch tires, wheels. Bikes that have a heavy mass, like a 600-pound bike versus a 400-pound bike. Bikes with a high rank angle, like 28 degrees versus 26 degrees. And I might be getting this backwards depending which way you look at it. Ones where the wheels tend to stick out more from the frame, we usually call that a low or flat rake. And the ones where the wheels are tighter to the frame, we call that a steeper or higher rake. But those rake angles are lower than they would be if, that long rake like a chopper A sport bike has a very steep rake. A chopper has a very long rake and low rake. So the point is that the longer the wheel is away from the steering head angle, the slower the bike is going to be to respond to the steering input, and it's going to take longer to tip over from left to right. The whole point of this being that the longer the bike takes to flop from one side to the other, the more it's in that transitional zone between turning one way and turning the other way, and that adds time and distance to the turn. And what I tried to draw here in this case is the consequences of that. If you start out with the wheelbase being a non-issue, the line that's vertical there is not really an issue. The length, the effective length, and the effective lateral dislocation in a turn is affected by how long it takes the bike to flop over into the turn. And you can see very quickly, very easily, that a bike that has a very high flop time, which tends to be your heavy bikes, okay, they take more distance along the initial path of the turn and more distance into the turn to reach a steady state turn. Even if the turning radius is the same, and I didn't draw it the same in this case, so you can forgive me on that. Even if the turning radius is the same, the bike will still reach its steady state position at a much farther point down the road than a bike that turns over quickly. Now, this is a very significant thing. This can cause real problems, especially when you're making a lot of turns, because it essentially requires you to either go slower or start to turn earlier, okay? And if you don't start to turn early enough with these big bikes that require a lot of lean to get them over, a lot of force to get them over, you can run into a situation where you just don't have enough time to get the bike to lean over enough to make the turn. Even if it can make the turn in terms of a steady state turn, in terms of lateral acceleration, you don't have enough distance to get the bike to turn enough to make the turn. And there's a big difference between it can't sustain the turn and it can't start the turn. Those are two different things. The big problem that people tend to run into is not starting the turn early enough. And that runs entirely contrary to what people tend to say, like Keith Code in his Twist of the Wrist book and stuff. Wait until the last minute. Wait until you can see down the turn. Wait until you can, you reach the outside of the fastest turn where you're going to apex to the middle and all this kind of stuff. There are a bunch of reasons that is a problem. That part of the road tends to be dirty, number one, and number two, that is your last opportunity, the last opportunity to turn if you do it that way. If you don't make the turn sharp enough, hard enough, and soon enough, you simply can't make it. It doesn't matter if you're going 20 miles an hour on a 20 mile an hour turn or 60 miles an hour on a 20 mile an hour turn. You have to start the turn soon enough to actually get the bike turned into the turn to finish the turn. If you wait too late, you are going to run off the road. It's that simple. It's not a question of ground clearance. It's not a question of your rider skill in terms of your ability to counter steer, lean off the bike, drag your knee, all that kind of stuff. It's a simple matter that you don't have any road to work with, and you are asking for disaster at that point. So one of the things that riders of bigger, heavier bikes tend to do to compensate for this is they over lean the turn to compensate for the fact that it took them longer to start the turn. Now, in that case, a rider on a bike that's light and easy to flip can, say, make the turn at, say, 25-degree lean, and a rider whose bike takes twice as long to flip over has to make the turn at, say, 45-degree lean if they start at the same point. If they begin to pull that turn point further up the road, yes, they can turn the bike at 25-degree lean, but then they lose an additional 10, 20, 30 feet of braking distance on the turn. And also on the outside of the turn, they lose both acceleration and they also have to sustain the turn for longer. And because the bike is in this transitional phase and leaned over for longer, or leaning over at a higher lean angle, you become more susceptible to the problems that motorcyclists can run into while they're leaned over than someone who isn't leaned over or not leaned over as much. And that's where real nightmare things can happen. Say you come out of a turn and you need to stop, or you need to sharpen the turn, or you need to get out of the turn early because there's gravel on the road. You just lose options in that regard, while admitting the fact that it doesn't mean that you gain this incredible set. You don't get like superpower. You know, like, you know, the Flash, where you can suddenly flip the bike back and forth, left and right, and avoid all kinds of trouble. You really can't do that. But what you do lose, that 10 feet or 20 feet or so, that could make the difference between wrecking and not wrecking. All right, so let's put some of these concepts into practice here. First guy we'll take a look at is on a Hayabusa, and a Hayabusa definitely exemplifies the problem that you have with this tilt rate causing the extension of the turn. The bike takes forever to roll over, and what you find out is that your turns will be stretched out. The bike takes a lot more distance to make the turn, and even though you can lean it over, way over, what you find out is that you tend to run wide pretty often, and then you struggle to tighten up the turn and actually make the turn on the road, and then that causes riders to grab a huge lean angle, and that is where they run into a lot of trouble with ground clearance and tire adhesion. So the point is that the bike takes much longer than you really think you have to make the turn, and then you end up overcompensating it by overleaning. All right, so what kind of problems can you get into with a bike that handles quickly, in the sense that it flops over quickly from one side to the other? So I'm going to show here some slides from a video showing a guy wrecking a Ninja 300 into the rail on the side of a downhill sweeper. You can see, obviously, this isn't very sharp of a turn. The guy starts out on the classic racing line on the outside, goes down, cuts towards the center of the turn, doesn't quite go all the way across, which is, good. He didn't take it to the very inside of the outside lane and expose himself to traffic coming the other way. But he does go wide on the turn, and you can see his brake light comes on, and so he hits the brake maybe a half second before he runs into the guardrail on the side. And you can look at this as a combination of a couple of factors. I would say it's at least an indication the guy didn't really know how to turn the bike. Maybe the bike does flip over quickly, but you still have to actually turn it, and it's not going to turn unless you counter steer properly. When there's a certain, little microscopic amount of turning you can get out of steering into the turn on a bike that's doing, say, 50 miles an hour. But to really get it to turn, you need to counter steer it. To really get it to flip over on its, to lean over at, say, a 45-degree lean angle, you need to counter steer it. Steering into the turn isn't going to get you hardly any turning at all. It might turn a little bit, certainly, but it's not going to turn the way it should. And I think this is a pretty clear case where the guy didn't counter steer the bike. The bike wasn't making a turn. He saw that, hit the brakes. The brakes caused the bike to stand up and go towards the outside of the turn even more. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But for right now, just he hit the brakes. The bike shot towards the outside rail, and at that point, he was screwed. He didn't know how to turn the bike, and he wasn't going to turn it the way he was going. It was going to go straight. So he hit the rail and wrecked, and that's pretty clear cut. Now, the big problem here is, aside from the lack of counter steering, if you use the brakes in a turn, the bike is bleeding off speed, and as it bleeds off speed, it's going to want to go straight. It's not going to want to lean. It's not going to be able to sustain the same lean angles as it would when it was going faster. The slower the bike goes, the more it's going to want to straighten up. That's simple physics. It can't lean over as much because there's no centripetal force or centrifugal force, depending on how you look at it, that's causing the bike to sustain the lean. It has to go straight. It has to straighten up and go straight. So the big thing with leaning over and then hitting the brakes in a turn because you're going too fast at the turn, or you can't sustain the lean angle or whatever, is This can be used as an accident avoidance technique if you use it in tiny parts. You don't want to hold the brakes on. You straighten the bike up, hit the brakes hard, slow the bike down, and then you can go back in a turn. You can get into a tighter turn at the same lean angle. It's certainly a successful accident avoidance technique if used properly. And this is one of the problems that you have with motorcycles, regardless of what kind of bike it is or how quickly it leans over or how slowly it leans over. If you don't know how to ride, it isn't going to matter. You're still going to wreck the bike anyway. If you're dumb enough to ride the bike into a corner faster than the bike can actually make the corner using the techniques that you have at your disposal. Now, maybe somebody else can do it on that bike, and maybe somebody else can do it on a bigger, slower handling bike, but you can't do it on that bike, and that's what really matters. And the bike will be very quickly unrideable, and the whole problem will be solved. As long as you don't have a hospital stay coming out of this, you're going to be at least a learning experience, but you'll lose your ability to wreck your bike further. So that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. But the big thing here is, don't ever forget that just because the bike, quote unquote, is a quick handling bike means that you won't run into trouble because you don't turn the bike fast enough. That is always going to be on the table. A second problem, the third problem I think happened here in this case is that the rider saw that the next turn was a right-hand turn and realized that they needed to get ready for that right-hand turn, and they weren't in the proper position to be making that right-hand turn using the same line that they just made through the left-hand turn. If they wanted to use that line, they needed to be on the outside of the right-hand turn, which is the inside of the left-hand turn. And if you're going to take S's, you have to plan for the second turn. The rider needed to be more towards the middle, not heading towards the outside of the right-hand turn before the left-hand turn before the right-hander. So I think he got confused. I think he didn't have the skills on several levels that he needed to make this turn. And unfortunately, you just can't make a bike that's going to make up for a complete lack of skills, riding ability, and a overestimation of riding speed into a turn. And accidents are going to happen no matter how fast the bike handles. Also, you can run into a problem where the bike handles too fast. It just requires constant concern and corrections with the handling. The slightest disturbance can make it turn. And you have to be careful not to ride it too far to the inside of a turn as opposed to too far to the outside. One of the things that the rider avoided doing in this case was pulling way to the inside of the turn and crossing over the double yellow. Now, I'm sure if you look around enough on YouTube and you ride enough with other people, you'll see people crossing the double yellow because they can't hold the turn when they're when they're turning on the inside. This guy's turning on the outside, came over towards the yellow, but he still kept about a bike's width away from it. Some people would just cut that line in the center and flatten the turn out even further. And in this case, you can see the guy was lucky he didn't do that because the car was coming the other way right at the time he was approaching the center yellow line. So one of the things you definitely want to make sure when you have a bike, no matter how fast or slow the handling is not to go crossing across the double yellow lines, especially when there's traffic coming the other way. You don't even really want to ride near the center of the road because the traffic coming the other way can come across the yellow line and hit you. So this is a great example of really the issues that you can run into with a bike, even if you have a bike that handles quickly, is light handling. And it's not the lightest and quickest handling bike that I can think of. The R6 is certainly more lighter and less stable. And I think this is overall a topic that gets a lot of people into trouble because they're always worried about power and worried about speed and worried about braking and worried about grip and all this kind of stuff. But what they don't really take into account is the thing that really matters is, regardless of whatever the bike does, you still have to get it positioned right. And that means you turn it, you straighten it up, and you have to do these things at the right time, or at least it's in enough time, but not too soon, or you're going to wreck. And I think this is the key that so many people miss when riding, and this is what catches so many people out and causes so many accidents.